Да, только через ресивер, ну, эту штуку.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Проверка звука. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Skal vi ikke have noget af prisen? Og er der navn på, eller hvad? Nej, det er der ikke. Det er bare conference. Hvis du mangler noget, så skriv det bare ind i WhatsApp. Ja.
1, 2, 3. Проверка. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 1. Проверка звука. 1, 1. Прием, прием. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Раз, два. Проверка звука. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Надя, можешь сюда подойти?
Один, два, три. 1, 2, 3. Нормально? Раз, два, три. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Вова, как дела? Хватит?
They are sharing their findings with others.
Det kan vi. Men kan ikke mere, fordi det har PM voice.
Det er bedre.
Ja. Er det bedre?
Ja, det. Ja. Nej, jeg kan jo huske på det. Peter.
Den her, ikke?
Okay.
Så når der er et halvt minut tilbage, så lyser.
Could I please ask you to take your seats? Could I please ask you to take your seats? Ladies and gentlemen, could you please take your seats? Ministers in front. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please take your seats? Ladies and gentlemen, would you please take your seats? Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Ukraine Reform Conference in Copenhagen, which we hope will help drive change in Ukraine. The conference is hosted jointly by the government of Denmark and the government of Ukraine. After a welcome speech by the Prime Minister of Denmark, the Prime Minister of Ukraine will deliver a keynote speech on the reforms taking place in Ukraine. His speech will be followed by statements from national delegations and international organizations. And at the end of the plenary, the Prime Minister of Ukraine will give his concluding remarks. You should note that the event is live streamed. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to the Prime Minister of Denmark, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, for his welcome speech.
Prime Minister, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Copenhagen, welcome to the Ukraine Reform Conference 2018. It is indeed an honor for Denmark to be hosting this event I hope and expect it will help Ukraine to move forward. 2 years ago, I had the pleasure to visit Ukraine. Ukraine, a country with a unique history and culture, a mixture of East and West, and a story of hope and pursuit of freedom. Today, the struggle for a better future is more important than ever, and we have a lot at stake, not only for Ukraine, but for all of us. About 4 years ago, Russia set aside fundamental principles of international coexistence. Military aggression, hybrid warfare, illegal annexion of Crimea, and unacceptable attempt to hinder Ukrainian people's free choice of shaping their own future. But Russia did not succeed. They could not overcome the free will of the Ukrainian people. The sacrifice of the people on Maidan Square must not be in vain. The leadership of Ukraine and its international partners must keep struggling to ensure that new Ukraine prosper in the spirit of the revolution of dignity. Reforming a society fundamentally is an immense task. It includes disrupting the way things have been, how services are delivered, the way governance is exercised, basically how the wheels of society are put in motion. Yet, despite the magnitude of the task, and despite Russia's continued aggression, Ukraine has come a long way. Gradually, reforms are releasing Ukraine from old Soviet structures. Economy is improving, trade is expanding, people-to-people relations are growing. And day by day, Ukraine is moving closer to its European friends. Not at least through the association agreement, the free trade agreement, and the visa-free regime allowing Ukrainians to travel freely to the EU. Indeed, the new Ukraine is rising. Slowly, but steadily. You have turned a scenario of regression into a window of opportunity, and that calls for respect and admiration. Yet, in order for progress to continue, reforms must go on. It will serve to show Russia that breaching international law and principles is not tolerated, and that European values, freedom, democracy, humanity, and the rule of law are the foundation for all countries who strive for a prosperous future. One example is the fight against corruption. I would like to take this opportunity today to congratulate Ukraine on the recent adoption of the bill on the High Anti-Corruption Court. It is indeed a major breakthrough. I trust the Ukrainian government will ensure that the court becomes operational as soon as possible. We have also seen remarkable progress over the last 3 years in the energy sector. Denmark takes part in the efforts of energy reforms, and the goal is to make Ukraine independent of Russian energy. And Denmark has decided to support the Ukraine-Denmark Energy Center with an additional 20 million Danish kroner. The list of achieved reforms is impressive, but hard work still remains. Further economic development and growth is needed. Better framework conditions are required for businesses and investments, including foreign investments. Private companies depend on a well-functioning and independent system of justice. And privatization of many of the 3,500 state-owned enterprises entail a great economic potential and should be carried out without any delay. As good friends, we have to be honest. While a lot have been done, some reforms are moving forward at snail's pace. Old economic and political interests are trying to prevent change. Populist forces who argue that prosperity can be achieved without painful reforms Such interests and forces are not only seen in Ukraine, but if they succeed in Ukraine, the impact could be dramatic. Prime Minister, we are counting on you. Further reforms are Ukraine's tickets to freedom and long-term stability. And make no mistake, Denmark and the international community remain firmly behind Ukraine in your struggle to break the chains of the past. We are fully aware of your troubled starting point and your immense potential. We are on your side because you share our vision of true democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. You will not be forgotten and put to the side as a frozen conflict. And you are not alone on this journey of yours. There's no reason why Ukraine's citizens should not enjoy the same prosperity and quality of life as their European equals. And I firmly believe it is within reach if you keep doing your utmost to grab the opportunity. If you are halfway to your destination, the best thing you can do is simply to keep walking. I hope this conference will help and encourage Ukraine and its people to keep walking in the right direction towards a brighter future. And on this note, I will pass the floor to the Ukrainian Prime Minister, my friend, Volodymyr. Thank you.
Now, before we give the floor to the Ukrainian Prime Minister, we will show you a short video which has been provided by the Ukrainian government.
Ukraine now is a country with a huge potential which is being unleashed now. Now, the country is living through a period of changes, unprecedented by their complexity and scale. We do not merely implement a range of reforms, but essentially build a new, modern European state. Ukraine now is about reforms for the stable economic growth, good governance, human capital development, rule of law and fight against corruption, as well as the security and safety of the country. These objectives are outlined in the Governmental Action Plan 2020.
Мета цієї реформи, щоб прийшли люди, які можуть робити всі інші реформи. Вважаю, що перші результати є пристойними.
Реформа децентралізації, яка триває вже 4 роки, мінімізувала можливості розкрадати державні бюджети на національному рівні.
We see banking sector cleaned. We see deregulation goes on. We see VAT system has been cleaned. And we see also less attention from the law enforcement agencies and controlling bodies to business. So basically the openness of government is really enormous.
Ми створили Національне антикорупційне бюро, і тепер недоторканості, невідворотність покарання є для будь-якого чиновника будь-якого рівня.
Put the framework for much simpler privatization of the thousands of small state-owned enterprises and also streamline the privatization of large state-owned enterprises.
Після прийняття закону про приватизацію уряд нарешті може розпочати як маленьку, так і велику приватизацію.
On the gas market, we have already more than 400 gas suppliers. The renewable sector is also developing quite fast. We have more than 80 new energy projects started in 2017.
Розмову про запуск ринку землі розпочав український уряд. І це дуже позитивна новина, тому що, знов-таки, це перший уряд, який вголос промовив ці слова.
First is a government, so basically it offered equal rules for everyone. The new system offers a set of retirement options for people which are linked to the number of years in service. So basically in this way the government incentivized people to stay longer in their labor force.
This reform will work because it was designed for a patient, for people and together with people.
Я вважаю, що освітня реформа одна з найважливіших і одна з найскладніших. Задані амбітні дуже цілі, враховуючи економічний стан. Враховуючи війну, ми рухаємося, в принципі, досить швидкими, великими кроками.
Over the past several years, we have covered an uneasy path and implemented more changes than for the entire previous period of Ukraine's independence. However, much work remains to be done. The government is set to ensure that the changes are consistent and irreversible. Ukraine now means potential and opportunities.
Yes. And on that positive note, I will give the floor to the Prime Minister, Groisman.
Dear Prime Minister, dear colleagues, partners and friends, the fact that you are here today together with Ukraine shows that the success of Ukraine is your personal cause for all of you, and we do appreciate that we are getting together along this road of difficult changes and reforms, because those reforms are taking place in an extremely difficult situation in the country that for many decades was a hostage of the Soviet Union, and in the post-Soviet space today we have the only chance, the only possibility to be a success. I want to thank you for the platform that allows us to discuss today the state of affairs, the reforms in the country, to delineate the plans for the nearest future. However, what is really necessary is for us to broaden the horizons of our planning for long-term prospects. And I think that today we will be able to talk about that. The previous conference in London was the first one. Then the Ukrainian government, as the only executive team, had come to Kiev, to London, to tell our partners that we inside the country now have a plan that should allow us to carry out structural changes and reforms and open up possibilities for development of the Ukrainian state. Our only objective is to create systems for life in Ukraine that would give us a new quality, a European quality of life. But we do understand that transformations have to be profound and have to touch many areas at the same time. During that conference in London, I told about our 5 priorities: the educational reform, medical reform, privatization reform, clearly an important reform of the pension system that for many years, for several decades, had been completely unfair, and the land problem, which is very delicate for many Ukrainians. And from this rostrum today, I want to tell you that we have started 4 out of 5 reforms. And for the 5th one, we're communicating to the Ukrainian society actively, because the reforms, we all have to understand, we're doing it for the Ukrainian citizens primarily. We have to enjoy their support. We've started the changes in the education and healthcare. We've changed the pension system. We've made it up to make it, to start open and fair privatization. The presence of new laws shows that there is political will and readiness for the change. We keep moving. And for the 9th quarter in a row, we have been able to show economic growth in the country. But we're not going to stop there. We have serious and deep tasks in terms of the implementation of the reform of change, so that the people would feel that these reforms are taking place for their benefit. And I think that now we find ourselves in the position that would allow us, if the reforms continue, to make it a success. Clearly, we have challenges that we need to keep battling. Good news is that this year we have finished, quite recently, a full-fledged anti-corruption system, starting with the new requirements in terms of declarations, opening up all the registers, creating the anti-corruption agencies, but most importantly, that was created very recently. Yesterday, the new law on the new independent, specialized, high anti-corruption court was signed in by the president and took effect. That means that we have built develop the mechanisms that will allow irreversibility of sanctions, of punishment for corruption-related offenses. However, I do understand that we need to continue systemic change. And our plan is to make sure that all those reforms are practically implemented. There are reforms that have already been adopted, but this year we will see quite significant progress in terms of privatization. Privatization of the state-owned enterprises that will take place on the basis of a new law. And this privatization process, as I have promised back in London last year, will be completely supported, and it will be covered, which is very important, by the English law, which gives us additional guarantees for attracting investments to Ukraine. We need investments. We need to develop our economy. We need the new legislative base to provide guarantees to the investors. And we have prepared a package out of 35 new laws, some of which have already been adopted, and they guarantee, inter alia, the rights to intellectual property. Recently, a new, very progressive law was approved in terms of high currency, liberalization of currency regulations. We keep adopting changes that allow us to deregulate business in Ukraine, to make it easier and also to protect the rights of business people in Ukraine. These are our plans that we will implement this year. We will continue the profound change which is now taking place for the first time in the 27 years of our independence, where we want to reload all the governance system. We continue decentralization. That used to be that was a very strong step, including an anti-corruption step to improve the effect of managing public finance. 50% of all the public funds are now managed by the local communities. We have to continue this reform. The first results are very successful, and we already see them in very specific situations. We have to talk about the challenges as well. And I would like to talk about security first and foremost. Clearly, we live in a situation when we need to fight for the democratic values, to develop our young democracy. We feel this permanent aggression, attempts to interfere with our life, and life of the democratic world, attempts coming from the East, and we have to be resilient, we have to be strong. Within this context, let me deal with just one issue, an important one. This is the issue of energy security. Not only Ukraine, not only for Ukraine, but for our European partners as well. When we talk about the energy sector of Ukraine, we have to know that this year we've opened up new possibilities to become more independent. We've adopted a strategy that allows us, as a country that has quite good reserves of energy resources, to become a really established independent country in terms of energy. But this would not be enough if in parallel with that, dependence will grow on Russia. I'm talking about the project that has a purely security aspect. This is Nord Stream 2 project. We now have to show our political will, unity, in order to not to allow implementation of the project that would make many countries of Europe dependent in terms of their energy independence. Ukraine is capable today of providing transit supplies of natural gas to our partners. It's a joint and reliable system, and that's also our joint task, which is important for the development of democracy as well. Incidentally, this year we have changed the regulations in terms of the production of Ukrainian natural gas. And our reserves, we come second or third in Europe. We are a gas country, but the system used to be closed. And in many ways, it was incompetitive and corrupt, which was not allowed, did not allow us to open up this potential. We have simplified the fiscal policy in that respect. We have carried out deregulation in the area. In the nearest future, we will introduce very open, transparent electronic auctions, incidentally what we're doing for small-scale privatization this month through the Prozoro electronic system, which is recognized with the system of public procurement. We're starting electronic privatization now, which will make it competitive, open, and fair, and will definitely be a strong step to overcome any corruption threats. I think that today we have to ask ourselves, what kind of Ukraine do we want to see? Ukrainians have given an answer to that question. A strong one, democratic one. A strong, economically country, reliable for our partners and allies. The country that can be very clearly seen by its partners. That's what most of us present here would like to see in Ukraine. But are our joint efforts enough so that we would reach that objective in midterm? I think to give an affirmative answer, we would need to analyze the state of affairs, to analyze our joint programs that allow us to reach that sustainability that we're trying to reach. You know, there are very many threats we're facing that were created in the past several decades, and only in 2014 we started overcoming them. For example, a very difficult debt situation for Ukraine that was created until 2013 that requires that we service $5 billion on an annual basis. Today we have to fund the security and defense, not only to defend Ukraine, but in order to defend the democratic values and our democracy and our right to self-determination. Every year we spend at least 5 billion euros for that. We have cleaned and cleared the banking system. It cost us 4.5 billion euros. And in the nearest 5 years, our debt, we have to pay it back, and that's $33 billion US. All of that requires a completely new approach in terms of access of Ukraine to the new financial instruments in a new reality. And I think that it would be absolutely fair if we all here, as a result of this conference today, the conference between us partners and allies, if we created a high-level group where we could assess the real state of affairs and jointly would develop an action plan where we would clearly identify the instruments that we would need to provide new instruments in order for sustainability and success to be guaranteed. I'm absolutely sure that the government is capable of it. I am absolutely sure that the Ukrainian society is mature enough, and the expert community as well. Starting from the last conference in London, we have taken a good road together. We've started a good quality dialogue with the expert community, with our international partners, to find inclusive, good quality and transparent solutions. So I'm calling upon all of us, while we here have questions as to what we should do next, we should work together so that we would work in a sustainable way and we would provide for this joint success. I want to thank the organizers of today's conference. I want to thank the Prime Minister, ministers, for a possibility to gather this wonderful audience today and to talk about Ukraine. But we can talk for a long time. The most important thing is that we should make our decisions. As the Prime Minister of Ukraine and my government, we're not afraid of reforms. We know what real leadership is, but at certain times we need your support inside the country and support of our international partners. We rely upon your support, and as a result, we will come to a joint success that will meet the strategic interests of our country and our partners. Thank you for being here in Copenhagen today.
Thank you, Prime Minister Groisman. Now we have a long and very impressive list of speakers. I'll now invite the first speaker to come to the floor. Because the list is so long, we will encourage you to stick to only 3 minutes. There will be a clock and a red light or a yellow light to remind you that there's a long list and that we should see if we can stick to the timetable. Now first, the High Representative of the EU for Foreign Policy and Security Policy, Ms. Federica Mogherini. Please.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me thank the Prime Minister of Denmark, the Foreign Minister of Denmark, for gathering us all today. And if we are here today is to clearly say that we stand by Ukraine, by its people, by its government, and to support the reforms already done. And I would like to commend and praise the Prime Minister and all his government for the work done already, and to accompany and support all those reforms that are still to be achieved. We are here with you. The European Union and Ukraine have never been closer than today. Since 2014, the European Union has invested in Ukraine more than in any other country in the world. We've put together the biggest support package in our history. That is more than 13 billion euros. Our new association agreement is the most ambitious agreement that the European Union has ever developed with any partner country. Our advisory mission is supporting your work to reform the civilian security sector. And since last summer, the people of Ukraine can travel to the European Union without a visa. And this was not a signal from our side. This was an achievement that you had as a result of already important reforms. And more reforms are needed now. Not because we say that, but because we hear the people of Ukraine asking for these reforms. And you are the first one recognizing that and working on this agenda. And again, I would like to thank and commend you for your impressive work, Mr. Prime Minister. We all know that reforms are not taking place in a void. The challenges are huge because of the conflict in the east and because of the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. The European Union has always underlined Russia's responsibility in this, and we keep supporting Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence in a united and decisive manner. It is our European interest to protect this principle, which is that borders cannot be changed through military force. And it is our European interest to help Ukraine grow stronger and more resilient, as you said. Not only by continuing to work with Ukraine to address the challenges you're facing on the security field, but also through our support to the reform process. We know that the best way to make Ukraine and Ukrainians resilient is to support the reform process. As we have heard from the Prime Minister, there has been substantial progress over the past year on a number of key reforms. There has been progress on healthcare and pensions, the first social reforms since 2014. The reforms on decentralization, public administration, and public procurement will help Ukraine deliver quality service at a lower cost to its citizens. The first independent public service broadcaster has been established 2 years ago. The energy strategy up to 2035 will, among other things, contribute to the increased energy security of Ukraine, thereby strengthening its resilience. And I remember very well, when I last visited Ukraine just about 3 months ago, we were discussing about the urgent need to fight corruption, including, as a first priority, the urgency of establishing a high anti-corruption court. And I'm glad to see that the law establishing the court has just been approved. I would like to congratulate on this. And once the court is fully established, Ukraine will have the possibility to live up to the standards recommended by the Venice Commission. And this is important, in particular, to accompany the transitional phase by allowing the High Anti-Corruption Court to deal also with the existing court case. The court has so far been the missing element of the puzzle, as other institutions had been created before. Among them, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau has in particular been established, a good track record. And all these institutions, including the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office and the National Agency for Prevention of Corruption, need to be allowed to do their work now independently and efficiently. And more importantly, the anti-corruption institutions must deliver, including in high-profile cases. One of the most prominent examples of unfinished work is the Privat Bank case, where more than $5 billion were lost. Anti-corruption activists and civil society have also a very important role to play, and this is why we believe the e-declaration requirement for them must be revoked as a matter of urgency. To end, tackling corruption and improving the rule of law will not only fulfill the demands of Ukrainian citizens. I remember very well, 4 years ago, this was the main demand. But this will also improve business climate, encourage investments, including from abroad, and it will help ensure the effective implementation of the visa liberalization benchmarks. Because all the reforms we discussed today, and we support today, will have a positive impact on the lives of all Ukrainian people. We're talking about jobs, we're talking about liberties, we're talking about fulfilling the potential of the Ukrainian economy. This is the change the people of Ukraine want and need. The European Union will continue to stand on the side of reforms and to stand on the side of the Ukrainian people in a very concrete, reliable manner. You know that you can count on us. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the British Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson.
Thank you very much. Well, it's, ladies and gentlemen, Prime Ministers, it's wonderful to be here in this beautiful city of Copenhagen. I went for a run this morning, very, very slowly, down by the waterfront, and much to my astonishment, and to the astonishment of my security guys, we passed a group of Danish people diving stark naked in a fashionable residential district into the water. And I thought, I mean, London's a pretty progressive and freedom-loving city, but we've got nothing on Copenhagen. We haven't yet got this culture. And I thought how appropriate it was to this Ukraine Reform Conference, because now is the moment for us all figuratively, if not literally, to disrobe and to speak frankly to each other about the future of Ukraine and this incredible country. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. I visited it several times with the Prime Minister, with Pavlo and other colleagues. And as we all know, there are two parallel struggles taking place. One to resist external aggression, and the other to build security and prosperity through domestic reform. And the two things are inextricably linked, because there's no point in winning the struggle on the battlefield only to lose the economic arguments and lose the battle for hearts and minds. And it was great to hear Prime Minister Groysman describe the scale and the pace of reform that has taken place in Ukraine. And we all recognize that his achievements, the achievements of the Ukrainian government, have been against a background of relentless Russian aggression. And we must remind our friends and allies around the world of the realities of the threat that Ukraine faces. And I'm very, very encouraged, of course, by what you're doing in the face of that aggression, whether it's in Crimea, the Donbass, the ceaseless campaign of disinformation. And of course, it's necessary to keep up the pace of reform. There must be an amendment to restore the requirement of the Anti-Corruption Court, the High Anti-Corruption Court, to handle all cases under its jurisdiction, including relevant appeals against the decisions of the Court of First Instance. We need a new Central Electoral Commission and legislation to ensure the proper punishment of electoral crimes. Greater progress, privatization, healthcare reform, some of the things you've already talked about, Prime Minister, the implementation of a long-term energy strategy, and the UK will be there, the United Kingdom will be there. We are, as you know, I hope, one of Ukraine's strongest supporters in a pretty hotly contested field, by the way, because I see some other strong supporters of Ukraine here today. We provide, and we will provide over the next year, another £35 million of technical and humanitarian help. We will continue to help training the Ukrainian army, which I've seen myself, in order to strengthen your ability to defend your country. And we will help Ukraine to counter Russian disinformation, demine the conflict zone in the east, help run the 16 universities displaced by Russian aggression, and support projects for encouraging female empowerment and female victims of domestic violence. Now, incredible fact about next year, Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, will be able to give their verdict on the record of their leaders in building a more democratic, stable and prosperous country. And I'll tell you a stunning fact, ladies and gentlemen, about that election, with great respect to the distinguished leaders here, the outcome of that election is at this point unknown, which is more than you could say about the outcome of an election in a big neighbor of Ukraine, where the outcome was known for years in advance. And that is the fundamental difference in the great project on which Ukraine is embarked. And so I just say to our Ukrainian friends, you have begun, you have chosen a path of freedom and democracy, an independent judiciary. You have, to get back to my opening metaphor, you have taken the plunge. You have taken the plunge, or in the case of the High Anti-Corruption Court, you're about to take the plunge. And I don't want to develop this metaphor too much, but we're there to help you in that. And in every other respect, we're here to say to you, come on in, the water's lovely. And I think you have a great future. It will not always be easy. There will be difficult decisions that have to be taken. But I want you to know the United Kingdom is here to help. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and then I'll ask the Foreign Minister of Canada, Ms. Freeman, to take the floor.
Okay, you know, it's really not fair to have to follow Boris. And I am not going to join him in calls for disrobing of us, but I will join him in saying, Anders, thank you for the amazing welcome to this incredibly beautiful city of Copenhagen. Au nom de la délégation canadienne, je tiens à vous remercier, le ministre Samuelson et le ministère des Affaires étrangères du Danemark, pour votre hospitalité. Depuis le début de la crise en Ukraine en 2013, la population ukrainienne lutte pour l'adoption des réformes démocratiques et économiques, tout en faisant face à l'agression militaire et l'occupation illégale par la Russie. Comme vous tous, le Canada est un ardent défenseur des efforts déployés pour l'Ukraine pour rétablir la stabilité et mettre en œuvre des réformes. So, why are we here? Why does Ukraine matter to us? I think Ukraine matters today more than ever because liberal democracy and the rules-based international order are under attack around the world. And one of the world's critical battlegrounds is Ukraine. The success of Ukrainian liberal democracy and market reforms is first and foremost, as Boris said, essential for Ukrainians. But it's also essential for everyone, and I think that includes everyone in this room, who believes in the international rules-based order and liberal democracy. Canada does not accept the invasion of Crimea and its annexation because that was a grave violation of international law, and that is why I want to call here for the release of Ukrainian filmmaker Oleg Sentsov. Yeah. And I think we all support liberal democracy in Ukraine because we understand that Ukraine is the borderland between liberal democracy and authoritarianism. Now, yeah, it is. Now, what about Ukrainian economic reforms? I would like to join the Danish Prime Minister and my friends Federica and Boris in congratulating Ukraine on the creation of the Anti-Corruption Court and the other reforms that Volodymyr spoke about so eloquently. And I also want to echo the Danish Prime Minister, Federica and Boris, in saying, as our Ukrainian friends know, the work is not yet done. There is hard work ahead. There's a lot more to do, including in the field of energy. I also want to say to our Ukrainian friends, Canada's a democracy too. As Boris said, you guys have elections next year and no one knows the result. We happen to face elections next year as well. And as a politician, I can tell you, I appreciate that election campaigns place some interesting constraints, but also opportunities for politicians who want to get reelected. And I think that's something all of us need to really appreciate. On a personal note, I was a journalist in Moscow in the 1990s, and one of the saddest experiences in my life has been to see the descent in Russia from that admittedly chaotic but also wildly hopeful and optimistic democratic period in the 90s to an aggressive and dangerous authoritarianism today. I think it's fair for us to ask ourselves who lost Russia, and I'd like to say to all of us here, let's be sure we don't have to ask ourselves who lost Ukraine. Prime Minister Groysman talked about working with Ukraine on some kind of a medium-term strategy, and I think that's a great idea, and perhaps that's something that Boris, as the host of this conference last year, Minister Samuelson-Anders as the host this year, and Canada, which is hosting the conference next year, maybe that's something we could take on to work on together. And finally, I hope people will permit me briefly to speak directly to Ukrainians.
Ukrainians were the first to come to Canada 127 years ago. They moved over to Canada, over to the steppe zone, to horrible, wild steppe zone. It wasn't easy for them, but they did play a key role in developing my country, Canada, the country I am very proud of. Let me talk to Ukrainians present here, the representatives of the government, Ukrainians that are listening to me. You know what? You're no worse than those Ukrainians, that the Ukrainians live in Canada now. Don't do the reforms for us. Don't do the reforms because Frederica, Boris, me, or the IMF are encouraging you to do that. Please do these reforms for themselves, for you to live in the country that you deserve to live in. And let me promise to all of you that we all are going to stand by, will support you until the very end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. And now, the Foreign Minister of Lithuania, Mr. Edgards Rinkēvičs.
Thank you. Well, let me start by saying that actually it's Latvia. But as we normally are being mixed up with Linas, then most probably I can now speak on behalf of both and use 6 minutes. However, it is very difficult, of course, to speak after two prime ministers, Federica, Boris and Kristi, after this very eloquent kind of vision of reforms in Ukraine support, and I think that there is really not much to add. One thing that is absolutely clear, that we all support reform in Ukraine. We all acknowledge that reforms in Ukraine are being conducted in very difficult circumstances, and that actually it is very difficult to fight for your independence, territorial integrity and liberty, and also to conduct very difficult reforms. From that point of view, privatization, public administration, national security bill, anti-corruption efforts that have been taken by Ukrainian parliament and government, all those reforms are very relevant, and I think that the European Union just has said UK still part of EU, but soon not to be part of EU, and Canada already expressed their support. Let me also say that Latvia fully supports the reform from two angles. From bilateral, we will continue our programs, and also through European Union reform assistance effort. What is very important, what we really need, is political will to conduct further reforms. It's going to be very difficult during the election campaign, but I think that it is also very important that people see the results of reforms. And second, what is very important, that Ukraine and people of Ukraine do feel support, not only when it comes to lecturing about reforms, but also when it comes to very symbolic gestures. And one where I very much join Chrystia Freeland is in calling to free political prisoners like Oleg Sentsov. I think that we should step up the political effort there, on one hand. Another is also we need to continue to fight for implementation of Minsk agreement and for the peace in Ukraine. With those two things, with the political support and also with practical support, I very much believe that one day we will welcome Ukraine in European Union. We had yesterday quite an interesting discussion in General Affairs Council where we decided on opening the accession talks with Albania and Northern Macedonia next year if there are some criteria met. So I think that Europe is open, Ukraine is open, and I very much hope that we will be able to have a very good conference also next year where we will be having also debate on the future of reform. And I hope that Lithuania will continue in the way as I did just now.
I do apologize to the Latvian Foreign Minister and invite the Swedish Foreign Minister, Margot Wallström, to take the floor.
So, dear friends of Ukraine, thank you very much. I agree with all the thanks that have been already said from the podium, but I want to say thank you to you, Ukrainian leaders, for having us when we come to visit, for organizing everything, for trying to respond and listen to all the messages sent to you in different formats and different channels, and trying to accommodate us always when we come. I hope to be able to return soon. I find when visiting Ukraine that there are kind of two faces of Ukraine. It's a face of the modern, lively, vibrant Ukraine that does reforms in full force. But also an old Ukraine with the old structures, with the oligarchs dominating, with systems that are not really working well. And I think of how we can change the situation and also help this modern face to come out even clearer to all of us. And I think that this is why we are here, because we want that modern, democratic, vibrant, young, dynamic Ukraine to take shape in front of us. I also think I would like to start by giving a thought to the 10,000 people who have died in eastern Ukraine. I really think we must not forget the suffering and the misery in eastern Ukraine. And we also fully understand how this affects you, all of you in Ukraine today. But this must not be one of these forgotten conflicts that we simply don't mention any longer. I want to very shortly then use my last 1 minute to say something about decentralization and gender equality, because these are two areas that we have tried to take a particular interest in and take some responsibility to work on, and also areas where we are a large donor. And it's really exciting for a feminist government to see the growing interest in gender equality across the whole Ukrainian government. And I want to thank Ivana Klimpich-Tsintsadze, the Vice Prime Minister, for excellent cooperation in this area. And I think that this calls also for a stronger hands-on efforts to prevent the daily suffering also for women in the East. And we have to look at that in particular. You also hear us every time, also in the European Union, at our Foreign Affairs Council meetings, we say the same thing: fight corruption. And you have heard it being repeated from this podium, and probably all of us will say the same thing, because it destroys so much. It destroys the fabric in a society. It stops investors and companies from wanting to be there. And we heard it also at the annual Swedish-Ukrainian Business Forum lately, that this is the main hindrance for Swedish companies to establish themselves. So we can just encourage you to continue. Thank you you for what you said, because what you do in stopping, in investing in education systems where parents do not have to pay every day the teacher, or health system where you don't have to pay your doctor a little bit extra to get the health care you need. This is exactly how you avoid also, how you fight corruption effectively, and how you avoid a society from falling down. And you have to fight poverty. You have to reduce the differences between groups of people in your country, and that's also effective in fighting corruption. And finally, you have a unique force. You have a strong and vibrant civil society. So these people are drivers of change in your society. Take care of them and make sure that they can continue to be watchdogs of the reform process. And sometimes they put their lives on the line in their struggle to turn Ukraine into a transparent society. We support civil society in Ukraine, and we hope that they can flourish fully and avoid these invasive e-declarations for NGOs. This is one of the advice we have tried to give you. And finally, the Swedish government has the patience and the stamina needed to support Ukraine's reforms long term. If you continue to reform, we will continue to support. We will be there at your side. Thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you. And then I'd like to ask the Foreign Minister of Turkey, Mr. Cavusoglu, to take the floor.
Prime Minister Grossman, Excellencies, dear friends. First of all, thank you very much for this initiative, and Anders, thank you very much for hosting this year's conference. I am here to underline Turkey's support to Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, as well as the reform process. The success of these reforms are strategically important for all of us. Why? Because we want Ukraine to stand firm on its feet. This cannot happen if the reform process fails. Comprehensive reforms are never easy. I know it from my country as well. Yet, failure of reforms is not an option, and partially successful reforms are not good enough. On the positive side, the main driving force behind the reform process has been the will of the Ukrainian people. Another positive aspect is the government's commitments. Government's commitments to its own people, and Ukraine's commitment to the international organizations like Council of Europe and the European Union and OSCE. And I remember from my years in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the previous administrations unfortunately failed to meet these commitments. Federica can agree with me. She was also at the Parliamentary Assembly for 7 years. But I'm happy to see that the current administration, including Prime Minister Grossman, are determined, because they know that the best fix for what happened in Donbass and Crimea is a well-reformed and prospering Ukraine. I am encouraged by the information Prime Minister Grossman has shared with us. I am impressed by the dedication and openness. I am also glad that the shortcomings are also recognized, as well as the other challenges that Ukraine has been facing. For example, we know that much more needs to be done against corruption and oligarchization. And I agree with Margaret that unfortunately oligarchs has been still dominating the economy and the politics in the country. I know this firsthand from the complaints of some Turkish businesses in Ukraine. Of course, we do encourage our business people to work and invest in Ukraine. I'm very grateful that the administration has been also assisting them, but we also get requests of help against problems like unfair competition or corruption. Therefore, the decision to establish an anti-corruption court is most welcome. There might be some difficulties. I am sure all of these difficulties will be overcome during the implementation phase. Therefore, Ukrainians are right in telling us how important their country is for us. Indeed, Ukraine is so important for all of us, and I would like to reassure that Turkey will continue supporting our good neighbor, Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Then the Foreign Minister of Estonia, Mr. Sven Mikser, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So many wise things have been said already that there's precious little to add if I try to be original. I would like to start by adding my voice to those who have already thanked our Danish colleagues for putting together this important conference. We have, I believe, taken significant strides when it comes to Ukraine's relationship with the European Union over the past year, not only because Estonia held the presidency, the rotating presidency of the EU Council during the second half of the year, but I really believe that visa freedom with the European Union and the implementation of the association agreement and the CFTA have been important milestones. Ukraine has made considerable progress in its reform efforts, and we have to say that some of these reforms would be extremely difficult to implement even during peacetime. They are even more difficult since Crimea continues to be legally annexed and Russian aggression is still ongoing in the eastern part of the country. I would also like to reiterate Estonia's unwavering support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. But obviously, all this having been said, it is important that we encourage Ukraine to continue with the reforms, especially when it comes to the fight against corruption. And I join those who have said that the law on establishing the High Anti-Corruption Court is a very important and commendable step. But it's the first step towards the actual establishment of the court. It is vital to strengthen democratic institutions, to improve business climate and judiciary. A government, I believe, is strong when it includes all stakeholders to the decision-making process, and in this regard it's extremely important to also work with the civil society, who is a key partner for the government in fighting corruption and advancing the reform agenda. Rule of law is an important factor that can improve economic situation and attract or make the country more attractive to foreign investment. But I would like to say that rooting out corruption is not just a question of economic development and dignity, it's also a fundamental issue of societal resilience and national security, since corruption makes the country much more vulnerable to both internal and external threats. I would like to mention one area that is particularly dear to my Estonian heart. That's the e-governance and e-government solutions. I believe that this is the way to go, since it's a great way of fighting corruption and making the government more transparent and more accountable, and improving the trust that the people have in their own government. Reform efforts obviously do not happen in vacuum, so while we need to continue to support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, we must also continue to support Ukraine's European aspirations. The EU needs to reiterate the full commitment in supporting Ukraine's desire to change and choose a future, their own future and their own path. We should affirm that at the EU-Ukraine summit in July. And I very much would like to add my voice to something that Christia said. I think that while it's in Ukraine's interest, first of all, that they build a successful future for the country, it's also in Europe's interest. It's also in the interest of the broader community of democratic nations, since liberal democracy is under considerable strain and assault worldwide, and Ukraine is one of the most important battlefields in that fight. Ukraine obviously remains a priority partner for Estonia when it comes to our development cooperation. Since the beginning of Maidan, Estonia has provided over 10 million euro in support to the development in the country, including including humanitarian assistance. Estonian Center for Eastern Partnership has been set up to channel Estonia's reform experience and know-how to Eastern Partnership countries. One of our focal points and priorities has been support to building and strengthening anti-corruption institutions. So we welcome and strongly support EU's anti-corruption initiative that is being implemented by the Danish Development Cooperation Network, DANIDA, in Ukraine. I also want to underline another key aspect, that's working with the regions and local governments. I believe that the trust or the lack thereof that people have in the government starts at the local level. And so the trust building towards the government and vice versa also needs to start at the local level. And this is why the Estonian Center for Eastern Partnership has designed this program so as to activate local partners and local institutions and local governments. And they focus very much on, for example, on development of professional skills of local media outlets and building cooperation between local governments and the civil society. To conclude, it's true that reforms can be and very often are painful. We know that from our own experience during the past quarter century. However, the reforms do pay off in practice for the benefit of not just the government and the country, but of the people. Thank you.
And now the time has come to welcome the Lithuanian Foreign Minister.
Prime Minister Groisman, very good to see you again. Anders, thank you for hosting this event. Edgars, thank you for a good introduction to my speech. And I'm really glad to see all of you, many friends of Ukraine. As Federica said, probably we all standing by. Definitely we all, it's many more friends than in this room. And also I'd like to say that politics, economy, and security is overlapping these days, especially in Ukraine. A few days ago I came back from eastern Ukraine, region of Lugansk. I visited contact line. I saw how Minsk violations are important and how painful for local people. By all means, not only by using prohibited weapons, but also in human, so to say, aspects. When one border crossing point for pedestrians is working instead of few, people waiting in heat for 6 hours and nobody cares about them. This is also important as we speak. It's not economic reforms, it's some everyday life of these people. We have to show our compassion, our empathy, but also we must act in this regard. So what I would see in chain of these conferences, which were thanks to Boris, who hosted in UK, now Anders here and Christia, it's great that you're taking over this initiative. I'd like to see really three points, let me single out. First of all, to make our rapprochement between European Union and Ukraine more tangible, more clear, with all aspects. And first of all, I have in mind connectivity, so to say, initiatives. Digital connectivity, as a roaming, for instance, that would be also important place. We are anticipating that Ukrainians are delivering, but we also must deliver in the principles of energy union, for instance. It has to do with Nord Stream 2. So this is really something which sets the scene. And this is the process which it's over, so to say, helming and inclusive for all of us. Also, I'd like to see strengthening Ukrainian capacities, absorption capacities, administrative capacities, less bureaucracy, less corruption. So we welcome also, same as all of you, this court on the corruption. I hope it will be operational as soon as possible will deliver some results. And especially to see a long-term platform for the process to come. I believe it's very, very important to understand that threshold of requirements is high. Nobody is going to lower. That's understandable. And I'm not giving any indulgence, but just trying to draw attention that Ukraine also paying for war. Several billion dollars per year comes for war costs, 5 even. This is really every year the price of peace and price of war. So I'm not saying that this is kind of excuse for what they are not doing, but just taking into account. So to make this driver for change, it's not enough to stand by. It's very important to act standing by. And I invite all of you to do that. Thank you. Thank you.
And now the Foreign Minister of Norway, Ms. Ine Søreide.
Thank you, Prime Minister Grossman, dear friends. It's really good to see so many of you here in this wonderful summer day in Copenhagen. And thank you, Anders, for hosting us, but also for hosting us on such a wonderful day. That's more than a host actually should be responsible for, but you've done it in a wonderful way. Norway is a very committed friend of Ukraine, and we stand by you both politically and economically. And of course, as you know, and as we always reiterate, we fully support your sovereignty and also territorial integrity. Our support package over the last 5 years have amounted to more than 100 million euros in addition to the humanitarian aid. But I would also like, when we're talking about encouragement of the number of reforms undertaken and the pace right now of the reform work that is so important, we know that the circumstances are challenging, but I would also like to echo what Christia said, that I think is so important. This also happens at a time where the international rules-based order is under pressure, if not under attack in some instances. I would like to emphasize 2 things in my remaining 2 minutes, and those are 2 real drivers for change. The one is energy reform, which is so important. It's not only important to curb corruption, but also in the overall recovery of the economy. And today, the energy sector has actually been becoming a crucial driver for growth. Over the past year, I am happy to say that Ukraine's reform efforts are clearly leveraging interest and investment from Norwegian business partners. Substantial investments within renewable energy, namely especially within solar plants and wind, are looking very good at the moment. And we'll continue to support energy efficiency and reforms, including our dialogue with Naftogaz and also corporate governance through the assistance of OECD. And we are also looking into ways of how to broaden this support. The second thing is more investment, and we would like to see more investment between Norway and Ukraine in both ways. Structural reform is absolutely no easy task, even at the best of times, but we think that it's crucial to underline that even though it is costly and also has some political costs, it's still necessary to do so. And the reward in the end will probably be more investment also from Norway. We need to see Ukrainian business environments to be more predictable and competitive, and of course, a trustworthy and effective legal system is at the core of this. Let me stress the importance that many of you have done already of a truly independent anti-corruption court as a catalyst for private investment. I cannot underline that enough, how important that is going to be also in the future. The importance of promoting transparency, the importance of zero tolerance for corruption cannot be overestimated. So you are in a very decisive year, and we in Norway, we stand by our friends, but we don't only stand there, as we said, we also act when we stand there. And we also need to speak up to our friends when we see that it's needed to give a push in the right direction. So even in a pre-election mode, and all of us knows how difficult election years can be and how much energy it takes and also how much energy it gives. But also in those times, it is extremely important to make sure that all our expectations for effective reforms, they will remain high, and we will continue to support you. Thank you.
And then we'll invite Mr. Karen Cannon, Minister for Diaspora and International Development of Ireland, to take the floor.
Thank you, Prime Ministers and colleagues. I'm delighted to be here today to contribute to this very, very important dialogue. I would like to thank the governments of Ukraine and Denmark for convening this conference. We must continue to acknowledge the progress that Ukraine has made in its reform programme, and it's also an opportune time to demonstrate the international community's commitment to securing Ukraine's long-term future. Together with the Association Agreement, the government's reform programme provides that roadmap for Ukraine on its path to becoming a modern democracy. And in the past year, and despite difficult challenges, Ukraine has made very welcome progress on this journey, particularly in the areas of public governance and social reform. Ireland channels its support to Ukraine through multilateral fora such as the Council of Europe, the OSCE and the EU, and as part of the review of its diplomatic network globally, the Irish government has formally decided to establish a resident embassy in Ukraine in the coming 2 years. And that's going to enhance our political and economic relationship and help to identify areas where we can provide targeted support for Ukraine and build and strengthen that existing relationship between our two countries. Tackling corruption in all of its guises lies at the heart of the reform effort, and an independent, impartial judiciary is crucial in developing respect for and trust in the rule of law. So I welcome the recent progress made on the establishment of the High Anti-Corruption Court, and we encourage Ukraine to continue to engage with experts such as those at the Venice Commission to ensure that the judicial system reaches the highest international standards. And Ireland continues to actively support Ukraine in this area. The Irish judiciary has provided training on judicial ethics to the Ukrainian counterparts and subsequently hosted a study trip to Dublin with the EU advisory mission. And we in Ireland are very, very open to further structured cooperation in this important area. All of us in this room have direct experience of the challenges inherent in introducing necessary reforms. We understand that change is often difficult and rarely popular. And that's why successful reform programmes need to be underpinned by strong political commitment and resolve. Reforms also require the acceptance and the forbearance of those who will be the ultimate beneficiaries, the citizens. I recall visiting Poltava in a personal capacity almost 10 years ago, where I met with so many young Ukrainians who were exceptionally well educated, very, very ambitious and yearning for change. But that kind of change is never achieved overnight. And despite the remarkable progress to date, there is still much, much more to be done. So as the elections approach, it is vital that the government avoids any retrograde measures or backward steps. It must ensure that momentum is maintained and indeed accelerated under the current Reform Action Plan. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that Ireland remains unwavering in our support of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity, and is fully committed to supporting Ukraine in its continued efforts to implement political, economic and social reforms for the benefit of its country and its citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. John Sullivan, Deputy Secretary of State of the United States.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking Prime Minister Rasmussen, Foreign Minister Samuelson, the Danish government for organizing this conference, and of course my good friends from Ukraine, Prime Minister Groysman, his government, for being here. I'm proud to attend on behalf of the United States and to affirm once again the support of the United States for Ukraine. Our support is steadfast. We stand with Ukraine as it defends itself against Russian aggression and combats entrenched corruption. In 2014, as we've discussed, the Ukrainian people united on Maidan Square to voice their aspirations to live in a modern European state. I had the privilege of visiting Ukraine in February on the 4th anniversary of the Revolution of Dignity, and while I was there, visited the War Dead Wall of Honor and the Heavenly 100 Memorial. It was a very moving experience to pay tribute to the bravery of those who fought and sacrificed for the cause of freedom in Ukraine. 4 years after the Revolution of Dignity, Ukraine has made significant headway to make this dream of freedom a reality, and by working to address its biggest internal challenge, corruption. Ukraine has made great strides in transformational reform, but as we have all noted, there is still much work to be done. Corruption is a matter of national security. As long as Russia seeks to destabilize and manipulate Ukraine from within, corruption remains a major vulnerability. It drains Ukraine's economy, deters foreign investment, and drives popular discontent that Russia can exploit. Ukraine's reform efforts, with the support of the United States and so many other partners here today, have led to notable successes such as the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the Patrol Police, the ProZorro procurement system, and decentralization. While the United States is still assessing the specifics of the national security law, which recently passed, I'm very grateful that that law has been passed, and note the Ukrainian government has worked with NATO, the EU, and the United States to ensure that this law aligns Ukraine's national security architecture with Euro-Atlantic principles. We're hopeful it will constitute a major step forward toward Ukraine's goal to achieve NATO interoperability by 2020. It's these reforms and the promise of more that have prompted U.S. companies to invest in Ukraine. For example, Ukraine recently signed a contract with Westinghouse that will make Westinghouse, a U.S. company, the major provider of nuclear fuel to Ukraine beginning in 2021. This important strategic milestone, made possible through our bilateral partnership, will allow Ukraine to diversify its energy sources and reduce its dependence on Russia. But these successes do not mean the fight against corruption is over. Far from it. Ukraine is at a pivotal moment as entrenched forces seek to reverse hard-won achievements and prevent further reforms. Ukraine has already taken big steps to reform the oligarch-controlled banking system, which has helped to stabilize the economy. But there's much more that must be done to effectively reduce the influence of oligarchs in key sectors. Immense economic power is still too concentrated in the hands of too few, who do everything in their power to protect and enforce their monopolies, including through twisting the political process to benefit themselves. But with enough dedication and determination and the support of all those in this room who are friends of Ukraine, Ukraine can break this oligarchic system, as the United States did early in the 20th century through its anti-monopoly campaign. This trust-busting created a more competitive, open economy for the United States, and we believe trust-busting would do the same for Ukraine. In the meantime, it's crucial that other vital reform efforts remain strong. Ukraine must stay on track with its IMF program, which includes amending the new law that established the Anti-Corruption Court. We were pleased to see the broad support the law received from members of the Rada, but additional work remains. We'll hear today many other reforms that Ukraine can make and should make to install confidence in its political system, strengthen its economy, and attract more foreign investment. Ultimately, we must remember that the goal of these reforms, the overarching reason we are all gathered here today, is to improve conditions for the Ukrainian people, those citizens who took to the streets over 4 years ago to depose a corrupt regime in hopes of a better life. The United States supported the rights of those citizens then and continues to stand united with them now, working together to deliver the bright and enduring future Ukraine deserves. Thank you.
And I now call on Jakob Dyr, Deputy Foreign Minister of the Czech Republic.
Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, first, of course, thank you for inviting us, and thank you, Anders Samuelsen and Vladimir Groisman, for hosting and co-hosting this event. As you all know, Eastern Partnership, as a new kid on the block, was born almost 10 years ago in Prague, and of course, from all the Eastern Partnership countries, Ukraine is our closest and I would also say most strategic neighbor. Development in Ukraine and challenges Ukraine is facing cannot leave us indifferent. The conflict in eastern Ukraine is a permanent and imminent threat to the European stability. The crisis in Ukraine presents one of the gravest threats to global order in the past quarter century. occupation of Crimea and support of anti-government insurgents in the east of Ukraine by Russia is a breach of international law. We must remind Russia that it bears special responsibility for the resolution of this crisis. The Ukrainian post-Maidan governments have embraced a robust political and economic reform agenda. Although Ukraine does deserve credit for its reform efforts, the country is far from the social contract Maidan hoped to achieve. The Ukrainian modernization, given the size of the country and the scale of the existing problems, is unprecedented in the post-Soviet era. Ukraine has been facing the challenge of reforming almost all the key areas of the state's operation. And coming from the Czech Republic, having its own experience from the reform process in the 90s, transforming the whole society from the post-communist order, I know what I'm speaking about. We must commend the post-Maidan Ukrainian governments for reform steps taken so far, but more should be done. And as good friends, we must be honest here, there are definitely two priorities on our mind, and it's the rule of law and fight against corruption. We are ready to help in this task. We welcome the adoption of the law enabling the creation of the Anti-Corruption Court. But again, these laws are just bones, and we need to see and to have more muscles, stronger muscles. The country is facing a dramatic challenge between the demands of state and nation building. The good governance, rule of law are obligatory and unconditional parts of the state building. We understand that building of the modern nation in a hostile environment during fighting and external aggression is very demanding. While we have to see the wave of patriotism sweeping the country after Russia's aggression, it has made Ukraine more resilient, but it has also affected the perception of human rights. We wish Ukraine to be a modern, democratic, prosperous country sharing our common European values. Nationhood in Europe is based on citizenship, on social contract between citizens and state, not on ethnicity and common kinship. Creating new dividing lines based on language or religion cannot help to build the new, modern and united nation. Nevertheless, we understand that the general goal of the new law on education in Ukraine, which has evoked some issues with national minorities, is the inclusion. We expect the Ukrainian state to provide and to protect the same rights to all citizens. Modern nation must be inclusive. And from the neighbors of Ukraine, we expect respect to the loyalty of Ukraine's citizens to their state. Ladies and gentlemen, let me once again reconfirm the loyalty and support for our Ukrainian allies and partners. We will be always on your side. It would help our advocacy, the pro-Ukrainian advocacy of all of us in this room, if the Ukrainian government speeds up the final steps in the reform process before elections, and if it follows the very professional advices and comprehensive reforms suggested by reanimation package of reforms, for example. If you keep reforming, we keep supporting you, that's for sure. Good luck and see you in Canada next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the Deputy Foreign Minister of Bulgaria, Yuri Stak.
Distinguished Prime Minister, Ministers, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really honored to address you for a second consecutive year on the state of reforms in Ukraine. When we convened last year in London, the Ukrainian government had just launched its ambitious reform action plan for the period 2017-2020. Today we have all the reason to commend Prime Minister Groysman and his cabinet for having managed to launch most of the priority reforms set for 2017, among others in the area of pension system, healthcare, privatization and education. Improvements in the pace of implementation of the association agreement are also visible. Of course, it goes without saying that in order to further deepen its political association and economic integration with the European Union, Ukraine needs to continue its efforts in transforming its political, administrative and economic life. This is actually the experience of my own country, Bulgaria. We've been doing this before, but also after the accession of the to the European Union, and we're continuing to deploy efforts today. At the heart of this transformation lie measures aimed to foster good governance, the rule of law and economic growth. And it should be acknowledged that over the last year we have witnessed very encouraging development in this regard in Ukraine. One of the main lessons learned from my country's experience is that key to the overall success of the reform process, however, are further efforts to strengthen the impartiality and independence of the judiciary and to step up the fight against corruption. The recently adopted law on the High Anti-Corruption Court is a major step forward, and the prompt setting up of the court in line with the recommendations of the Venice Commission would testify to the commitment of the Ukrainian political leadership to uproot high-level corruption. Towards the end of my short intervention, I would like to encourage our Ukrainian friends to continue taking into account the interests of all stakeholders concerned, including representatives of national minorities, when implementing large-scale reforms, especially in areas such as education and decentralization. This is essential for achieving state and societal resilience, which would enable Ukraine to successfully withstand internal and external challenges, including external aggression and destabilizing hybrid activities. To conclude with, I would like to reaffirm Bulgaria's continuous support both for the reform process in Ukraine, but also for the country's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Bulgaria will also continue to support various projects and activities in Ukraine through its bilateral development cooperation program, with a particular attention to the area of education. Let me share my optimism that in the coming year the Ukrainian government would sustain the reform momentum and accelerate the delivery of tangible results in the remaining priority areas. Further reform efforts are critical not only for the advancement of Ukraine's cooperation objectives with the European Union and the IMF, but above all for meeting the legitimate expectations of the Ukrainian citizens for a better future. Thank you for your attention.
And now, representing Japan, Parliamentary Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Hori, please.
Your Excellencies, Honorable Ministers, distinguished delegates, it is my great pleasure to have this opportunity to participate in the Ukraine Reform Conference on behalf of the Government of Japan. Japan values the Government of Ukraine's sincere efforts in addressing the reform agenda, which was announced to the international community, respecting fundamental values such as freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, as Prime Minister Groisman have just explained. Since the conference in London last year, the government, the Verkhovna Rada, and the people of Ukraine have made progress in reforms in various fields, ranging from social security, including the healthcare and pension systems, to economic areas such as state-owned company reform, as well as to the judicial system. Above all else, anti-corruption measures are very important for advancing Ukraine's reforms. Japan welcomes the adoption by Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada of the law to establish the High Anti-Corruption Court as an important step forward. Reform never comes to an end for any country. Presidential and parliamentary elections will be held next year in Ukraine. We all call on the government of Ukraine to continue advancing domestic reform without delay. It is not only the Ukrainian people who pay attention to the progress of reform in Ukraine, but also international society. At the same time, I would like to remind everyone that the issues Ukraine faces, including the Crimean issue and the situation in eastern Ukraine, are challenges to the rule-based international order. In addition, I would like to mention that these are not only a problem for Europe, but for the entire global community, including Asia. As each representative has stated today, the G7 countries, the EU, and the international community respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and are providing strong support to Ukraine. Japan has committed assistance worth approximately $1.86 US to Ukraine and continues to contribute to infrastructure improvement and the reconstruction of eastern Ukraine, as well as to humanitarian assistance. Moreover, the role of the ambassadors of the G7 countries in Kiev is worthy of mention. They have been continuously supporting Ukraine's reform efforts in close cooperation with the government of Ukraine. Ukraine is a future-oriented partner, sharing fundamental values with Japan. Japan, along with the G7 countries, will continue to cooperate with Ukraine in its efforts to achieve reform, as long as Ukraine goes along with us. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. And now representing Croatia, Satra Bucic, State Secretary.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the organizer for convening this very important conference. Ukraine needs and deserves our attention. We welcome the efforts made by Denmark in leading the Ukraine anti-corruption initiative within the EU and for providing a substantial financial contribution in the field of development aid. Also, we would like to congratulate the government of Ukraine for its hard work resulting in a real progress on their reforms, especially the establishment of the High Anti-Corruption Court. Croatia advocates an inclusive approach towards Ukraine's aspiration for the European integration. Having in mind our recent European transition and experience, Croatia understands Ukraine's challenges but remains optimistic in that regard. We must keep Ukraine in our focus, offering their leadership, our understanding and assistance. I would like to mention here a couple of examples of Croatian contribution to Croatia's reform efforts. In 2016, Croatian government set up Croatian-Ukrainian Working Group for Cooperation that has successfully completed most of the goals set out in our action plan. We are currently defining areas of further cooperation. Our bilateral relations have intensified beyond the scope of the working group, exchanging high-level visits in the field of labor, social policies, economic cooperation, environment protection agencies, and energy, among others. We would like to incorporate Ukraine and the Croatian as well as on the European energy strategy by looking into the possibility that Ukraine uses the future LNG terminal on the island of Kirk. Parliamentary cooperation has also intensified with the expert and high-level visits from Verkhovna Rada. Our ministers of foreign affairs have remained in their close relations, looking into different modules of cooperation. Croatian Prime Minister Plenković is in regular contact with President Poroshenko, Prime Minister Groisman, and Vice Prime Minister Klimpuš. We are committed to our continuous humanitarian efforts and cooperation, which include placing Ukraine as a priority country in our new strategic national strategy for development and cooperation, providing greater focus for Croatian humanitarian and development aid to Ukraine through 2020. In the field of demining, we have extensive cooperation through frequent bilateral meetings between Croatia and Ukrainian experts and lawmakers with the aim to help Ukraine set up their effective action mind. In cooperation with the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Veterans Affairs, we are currently looking into providing treatment for Ukrainian soldiers. In addition, for the last several years, Croatia offers summer holidays on the Adriatic coast for hundreds of Ukrainian children to help them overcome the trauma of the war. And we are committed to continue that project. To conclude, I would like to emphasize that Croatia is cooperating with Ukraine on political, economic, and humanitarian level. We will continue to support our Ukrainian friends to continue their efforts and to help Ukraine on their path on reforms. Croatia stands on your side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, representing Slovenia, State Secretary Andrej Logar.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the floor. First, I would like to join other speakers in thanking government of Ukraine and Denmark for convening this important conference. The fact is that we are building on a very successful conference that took place a year ago in London, and we are grateful for having this opportunity to be able to speak a little bit about the progress achieved in Ukraine, and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister of Ukraine for presenting his ideas and resolve for the reform process in Ukraine. But as well as, of course, this is an ample opportunity for all of us to speak about the plans and the important work that lays ahead of us. I wish to take this opportunity also to reiterate Slovenia's firm and unwavering support for a democratic and European-oriented Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I want to be very clear. Slovenia does not recognize illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. We have reiterated opposition on many instances. We reaffirmed the importance we attach to our friends and relations with Ukraine. We have developed several concrete projects with Ukraine. We will continue our efforts to alleviate humanitarian suffering of people, particularly with the rehabilitation of children from the conflict area. Slovenia will also remain active in supporting the reform efforts. Our priority is the area of fight against corruption. We are also engaged in a public administration and decentralization reform efforts in Ukraine, and we are ready to cooperate closely with Ukraine in demining and victim assistance programs. Needless to say that we welcome Ukraine's commitment to reforms and the positive steps that have been made so far. I mean, some achievements are impressive. Ukraine has achieved launching important structural reforms and establishing several important institutions to support the rule of law, all of which has been achieved in a difficult and challenging circumstances. With the implementation of the reform under the association agreement and free trade agreement, the fight against corruption, we believe, should remain a key focus in Ukraine and in our relations with the country. The law on the establishment of the High Anti-Corruption Court is an important achievement, but we encourage Ukraine to consider the recommendations made by its international partners as well as by its civil society, and to introduce appropriate amendments when necessary. Slovenia supports the civil society in Ukraine. We believe the civil society plays an important role in the reform process, and we encourage Ukraine to ensure appropriate protection to many NGOs advancing the interest of Ukraine society. We believe it is also important and even essential that Ukraine remains committed to the consolidation of democratic institutions and effective implementation of the reformed policies, notably independent judiciary, efficient anti-corruption and election legislation. Improving business and investment climate is another very important goal, vital to ensuring a successful transformation of the Ukrainian administration, economy, and society. The pace of reform should, that's how we see it, continue and even accelerate during the upcoming pre-election period, as this sends a very positive and strong message to the Ukrainian public. The unity of political parties and their coordinated work is crucial in this regard. The rule of law and vibrant civil society will contribute powerfully to the resilience and security of the Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Now, representing Finland, State Secretary Matti Antonen.
Distinguished Chair, Prime Minister, Ministers, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by thanking our Danish colleagues for organizing this important meeting here in Copenhagen. On behalf of the Government of Finland, I would like to reiterate our strong solidarity to Ukraine. Our support to Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty stands firm. Ukraine is an European country, and we share the fate of Ukraine with all its reflections to the European security and beyond. Implementing the Minsk agreements is the only path to the lasting peace, and we hope that there will be new impetus after the latest Normandy format foreign ministers meeting. We are here to discuss the Ukrainian reforms. We want to give credit to the reforms already taking place in Ukraine. We also want to encourage you to continue with reforms, and Finland and other European friends are here to support you here. But the final ownership has, of course, to remain with Ukraine. We also encourage you to fully reap the benefits of Eastern Partnership, the cessation agreement, and the deep and comprehensive free trade area. Since the beginning of the conflict, Finland has allocated 35 million euros to projects in Ukraine. At the moment, we are increasing our support to education and energy efficiency. In education, which is the foundation of all societies, we will share Finnish experience and best practices from our own school system. In the energy sector, we will focus in energy efficiency, increasing the use of renewable energy and clean energy production. These all are essential to ensure sustainable energy supply, to decrease energy consumption, and to improve energy independence from external energy sources and to enhance resilience. Ministers, dear colleagues, Finland remains committed to stand by Ukraine in the reform work. Bold steps are needed. From our own experience, we know this is not easy, but essential. With these words, I wish Ukraine courage, resilience, and success in the work ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Then I'd like to invite State Secretary Ribeiro of Portugal.
Prime Minister Groysman, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, allow me first to thank, of course, the Danish government for promoting this conference and for the kind hospitality in which the sunny day also plays a role. After the London conference held last year, we convene once more to build upon what was achieved there and to wait on the reforms implemented since then. Most importantly, this event and the committed members of the international community gathered here in Denmark demonstrate a strong support for the ongoing reform process and, I am certain, will give it an added momentum. Portugal is well aware of the wide-ranging reforming process undertaken by Ukraine and welcomes the commitment by its government and its people to continue its implementation. The scope of the task at hand is great. That is undeniable, true, but its far-reaching ramifications and potential gains for the development of Ukraine as a whole should be a fundamental driver for sustainable change in itself. Portugal has been a steady and continuous supporter of European Union's political and financial assistance to Ukraine. In that regard, we consider that the European Union's assistance must match the efforts undertaken by the Ukrainian authorities in fulfilling the agreed commitments and implementing concrete reforms. Today's conference, and particularly this afternoon's thematic sessions, will allow us to debate on how we can address the remaining challenges, how we can find ways to promote good governance by way of public administration reform and the tackling of corruption, in which pervasive effects on society and on economy were largely mentioned by the previous speakers. We must also address the challenges of economic growth with a view to create sustainable and prosperous development model that benefits all Ukrainian citizens. In light of the upcoming pre-election period, Portugal believes that it is crucial to maintain the pace of reforms, both to meet the legitimate demands and aspirations of the Ukrainian people, but also to strengthen Ukraine's resilience. In this common endeavor, you can count on our support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now, the Deputy Foreign Minister, Papiec of Poland.
Prime Minister Horstman, Excellencies, dear colleagues, friends of Ukraine. Thank you very much for this conference. It is a very important meeting. We should keep Ukraine high on our agendas, especially in Poland. Why? I have 3 minutes or less now, so I will give 3 reasons of them. First, let me recall all these heroes of Ukraine, those fallen under EU flag in Kiev, or those protesting in all of the other Maidans in Ukraine. Let us not forget the effort of Ukrainian soldiers now in the Donbass and other places in Ukraine. They are fighting every day to protect the independence of their country. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten, not only in Ukraine, also in Poland, in other countries. Second, Ukrainian people were clear. They want to build a safe country. They want a country free of corruption. They want an accountable government. They want to be closer to the European Union. We hear you clearly. Today we emphasized the importance of the reform effort made by the Ukrainian government. Many said that already. More reforms have been implemented during the last 4 years than during the last 2 decades. But the reforms process is not over yet, and we are here to stress it among friends. If you want to upset your enemy, if you want to prove he is wrong, to use the words of the poet, you have to make Ukraine great again. You can go back. Third, you are not alone. Poland is anyone in this room has been committed to supporting Ukraine. We have worked together with the Ukrainian government, local authorities and civil society on a number of key challenges. Excellencies, just one final word. True progress can only be achieved by Ukraine itself. The ownership of the reform agenda has to be yours also. But remember, you are not alone. Look around. We are all here today, and we will stand by you tomorrow. Thank you very much. And I think it's some kind of massage to support the Ukrainian. And many years ago, when I was in underground solidarity movement, I remember a very significant heroes in Ukraine, a special Vasil Stus. And in this place, for this very, how to say, high officials, I want to remember this important poet and the hero of Ukraine. This is my contribute for him. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now the Political Director, Antje Lendertse of Germany.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister Grossman, Excellencies. Despite the extremely difficult security situation and the pressure of illegal annexation of Crimea and the ongoing destabilization in eastern Ukraine by the Russian Federation, Ukraine has made its choice. A choice to continue on in its reform path, break down bureaucratic barriers to investment, a choice to raise standards of good governance, and a choice to tackle corruption at all levels of society, including in the judiciary. Since the Revolution of Dignity, Ukraine introduced a number of European and international norms and standards to this end, and I reflected a long time whether I will mention again, like so many others, the creation of the law on the High Anti-Corruption Court. But I think I have to, because it's really a keystone of Ukraine's anti-corruption architecture, and we encourage, as others, the government to establish the court as soon as possible in an effective manner. Still, institutional changes have done too little to change behavior and attitudes. Several Ukrainian governments have been too selective in fully implementing key reform projects. But now, there is still those who benefit from the status quo are trying to block reform and influence the public discourse to their own benefit and to the detriment of the people. But the people expect that there will be reform, and they deserve it. It is only through reform that Ukraine will increase its resilience and will make it easy for the partners to continue, and we today commit, of course, to continue our support, the financial support and the technical assistance. And in this context, it is of utmost importance for Ukraine to keep the IMF program on track. Germany, as well as other EU members, the EU as such, and many fellow states and institutions have pledged its support and solidarity to Ukraine in return for comprehensive reform efforts. And why we do this, we need, and we all here assembled want, a stable, an integral, an independent, a prosperous and a democratic Ukraine. This is our joint goal, and I thank you that I can be here and express this for my government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now representing France, Deputy Political Director Eric Danon.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, Excellencies. Let me thank the Danish authorities for hosting this very important conference for Ukraine. We feel an energy here, much more than during our bilateral 0-0 football match yesterday in Russia. Much progress has been done since last year's conference in London, et merci au Canada pour sa proposition pour l'an prochain qui nous réjouit. This was one of the messages conveyed by President Macron when he recently talked to President Poroshenko. It was 10 days ago. And let me therefore begin by recalling that France remains strongly engaged in the Normandy format and reaffirms its commitment to finding a sustainable and political solution to the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. To that effect, there is no other solution on the table than to fully implement the Minsk agreements. The end game is the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty over the Donbass. Although the ongoing process has successfully prevented escalation, we are still far from implementing Minsk's key provisions. What we now need is to make good use of the small windows of opportunity lying ahead until the coming presidential campaign in Ukraine this fall. A Normandy ministerial summit took place on June 11th, and 4 foreign ministers agreed on a series of measures: lasting ceasefire, disengagement, protection of key civilian infrastructures, prisoners' exchanges, intensification of political talks, as well as preliminary discussions on parameters for a possible UN mission. Let me turn now to the reform process in Ukraine. 4 years have passed since Maidan. Ukraine has undergone important changes by setting on an ambitious reform process that has been said before. Much has been done in reforming the banking and gas sectors that were well known for their corrupt practices. In this regard, I would also like to welcome the adoption of the law creating an anti-corruption court last month. It is very important for us that this court becomes effective as soon as possible and effectively meets the standards expected by the IMF, the G7 and the EU. The recent adoption of the law on privatization of state-owned assets adopted in January 2018 is also a very positive step towards modernizing the economy and attracting foreign investors. Undeniably, Ukraine has shown it was committed to break away from its past and to undergo deep structural changes. However, the transformation is not complete yet. Major reforms that are determining for the future of the country still need to be implemented, such as reforming the land property system or public finances management. The reform of the judiciary lies at the heart of all reforms, since it lays the ground for establishing the rule of law in Ukraine and ensuring that reforming laws are correctly implemented. International assistance should be contingent to the progress made and to the concrete results produced. While acknowledging the results already achieved, France, in coordination with its international partners and within the G7 ambassadors group in Kiev, will keep a close monitoring of the course of the implementation process. France is fully committed to supporting this reform process in Ukraine. We are standing by, and we are very honored, inter alia, to be the leading European partner for the Support to Justice Sector Reforms in Ukraine project, also known as PRAVO project, aimed at consolidating the reform of the judiciary in Ukraine. Mr. Prime Minister, Ministers, Excellencies, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, second to last speaker on my list is representing Switzerland, State Secretary Ruth Huber.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me express the deep appreciation of the Government of Switzerland to the Prime Minister and the Government of Ukraine and to the Prime Minister and the Government of Denmark for convening today's conference. Dear friends of Ukraine, solidarity and responsibility are core values in Switzerland's understanding of itself as a European state. That is why Switzerland is committed to continue to support the efforts within Ukraine to build a peaceful and prosperous future. I'd like to emphasize 3 priorities of our engagement in Ukraine. First, we strongly believe that peace and security are first and foremost a joint responsibility. That is why Switzerland continues to be actively involved in the work of the OSCE. under the Italian chairmanship. Switzerland continues to second experts and monitors to the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. Furthermore, Switzerland is convinced that Minsk is the only place where all sides can assemble regularly at one table in order to discuss issues related to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. We therefore support the work of the Trilateral Contact Group through the secondment of the coordinator of the Working Group on Humanitarian Issues. Secondly, we will continue our efforts to alleviate the suffering of the people most affected by the conflict. Switzerland will pursue its assistance to eastern Ukraine in order to support those affected by the conflict, including internally displaced people and their host communities. Switzerland has been providing humanitarian assistance through direct assistance and as part of international relief efforts. Switzerland is also pursuing a longer-term development approach. In this respect, the capacities of local, regional, and national institutions to deliver services effectively need to be strengthened. And thirdly, Switzerland remains committed to supporting Ukraine in continuing its decentralization and local governance reforms, its healthcare reform, and inclusive, sustainable economic development. Ukraine's unprecedented reform efforts are already yielding tangible results, which call for increased communication efforts. But for Ukraine to thrive, the economy needs to grow. We remain committed to working with Ukraine on the reforms that foster economic growth. This includes framework conditions for SMEs, including facilitated access to finance, the further integration of high-quality agricultural goods into global agricultural value chains, the more efficient use of energy in industry and local public services. But of particular importance are further advances in the area of judicial reforms and anti-corruption, building upon the new law signed yesterday, as we have heard. As we all know, corruption and vested interests slow down progress and discourage investment. Ladies and gentlemen, making reform happen is a long and winding road, but never forget where and why you started. Your original objective must continue to motivate and guide you to your final destination. Let me reiterate in conclusion that Switzerland remains firmly committed to supporting Ukraine on its path towards a more prosperous and democratic state where all voices are heard and no one is left behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now for the last speaker, Vice President Hudak of the European Investment Bank. Please.
Szanowny Panie Premierze, thank you for the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of the European Investment Bank, the Bank of the European Union. Szanowny Panie Premierze, dziękujemy za...
Thank you for being patient, Mr. Prime Minister.
But probably not by everybody. So let me focus just on a few things. Actually, I would take the example of Prime Minister and make 5 points, as he mentioned in the points of priorities of the UK government. And I guess I'm here also because, as we know, in reality, money talks. And representing one of the international financial institutions, I think that this is an example. So the 5 points. First one, reforms. The whole conference is about reforms. Obviously, I think there are many ideas, many things were already said. I think there are many suggestions to the government. A lot has been done. Of course, it is, at the end of the day, it's about the political will, about the will of the government to move forward and to push for the reforms. And our biggest hope is that the pre-election situation, which is very complex in Ukraine, is not going to slow down such reforms. It is important to continue. The second point is about the business environment. What we have learned from our experience in the European Union during the financial crisis time is that the government money, the public money, is not enough. It's never enough to do all the things which have to be done. And I think the same is the situation in Ukraine. And it is important that the government creates opportunities for the business, for private sector to join with the government to push for reforms and to make things happen. So it is important to create transparent rules. It is important to have a court system which supports the businesses. And it is important that in the process of deregulation, new regulations are created. Because all these hazy, grey situations and areas are always risky for the business, and what business does not like is uncertainty. Third point, European integration. Ukraine has always been part of Europe by its history, by its culture, by its geography. My father is Ruthenian, and he was always proud of being from Ukraine. And also, I think the countries of Central Europe, like my own, Slovakia, has shown that in this reform process, which is very confusing sometimes and very painful, you need to have some kind of guiding lines. And for us, it was always the integration with the Europe, which was a guiding principle. And I believe that this is something which can also help the Ukrainian government to make some painful decisions. And I think the European integration is very important. And we know that politically, and I think the foreign ministers know it very well, it's not an easy exercise. But I think we can do many things in reality. We can make European integration in reality. And this is where the European Investment Bank, but also our partners from the EBRD and others can help. And such projects as the Beskidi Tunnel, for example, which we opened recently, or different kind of connectivity, transport, energy area connectivities can help in this direction to make European integration in practice. The fourth point is better utilization of the international financial assistance. Today, the overall amount of unused money, of undisbursed money from the different IFIs is around 10 billion euro. This is the money which is sitting on the accounts of these banks or on the accounts of the Ukrainian Central Bank or Ministry of Finance, which could be used immediately if there are projects and if there was absorption capacity. So let's do it. Let's use this money quickly, effectively, and let's do it in the way which delivers results for the people of Ukraine. And here I would have a proposal, Szanowny Panie Premiere, I would have a proposal to create an office of a coordinator for international financial assistance under your supervision, reporting to you. I think it's very important. And who would coordinate such cooperation with IFIs, and who would also make sure that the delivery of projects and the utilization of the funds available is done quickly, and there is a kind of fast-track status for the projects supported by IFIs. Thank you. Last but not least, my fifth point, very simple. I want to confirm our support from the EIB, the Bank of the European Union, and we will be your partner in the process of reforms. Thank you. Ďakujem.
Thank you very much. This concludes the list of speakers. Thank you for all the words of encouragement and support for reform in Ukraine. I will now pass the floor to the Ukrainian Prime Minister to make his concluding remarks.
Good afternoon again. Thank you very much indeed for your kind words. Let me just stress that it was very interesting for me to listen to different positions as to what's happening in Ukraine. The views are different, are diverse, and that brings the idea in my mind that we need to work jointly to make realistic assessment of the progress of the reforms as well as the tasks we are facing in the future. That's why the idea that I came up with to create a small group that would be able to assess both the progress as well as tasks and tools available would be really appropriate, so that everybody, including those present in this room, could have adequate understanding of the situation in the country. But let me go back to what we started and where we are going to. As soon as I hear that we encourage the government to continue reforms, let me answer to that. Okay, we do appreciate this encouragement, but we are already encouraged. We are encouraged by our state, by the aspiration of the people to change their life. We are willing to change the quality of life in our country. We know that the potential of a 45 million people country is really very high. And in this case, let me encourage international partners of Ukraine so that we, by practical, specific joint efforts could speed up this process. And you are speaking the truth. You are talking about the right things, that there is the country that is partly remains of the old system and the country of new solutions. You are quite right to say that here we have more tangible success, and in some things we need to invest more efforts to see the results. But as soon as we are talking about the transformational period, transitional period, we have to note that in addition to decentralization that was started on April 1, 2014, in 2014, in extremely difficult conditions when we had $10,000 on the account. We had Russian aggression, annexation of Crimea. At that time, we shaped new Ukrainian institutions following democratic elections. And in fact, on January 15, with new parliament and new government, a new president, we launched on the path of changes. Actually, 3 years after that, we are talking about the results, and I'm very proud that our European partners, international community, have successes that is the result of the hundreds of years of development of their countries, but 20 plus years of our independence. Well, you know, you have to remember that for more than 70 years we were part of the Soviet Union. We have a little bit more than 20 years of our independence, and we are almost the only country in the post-Soviet space that has a clear-cut focus in terms of the values and priorities that we have. And today we started changing the system. In fact, we see the birth of absolutely new European Ukrainian state developing, shaping, and being born. And that's only 3 years after that. I want to speed up the process. I want to see better quality, but not everything depends on me. Everything depends on our joint efforts, and what we need to do in our state is something that we set as the task for us to complete. What is happening simultaneously in our country? And just imagine, can you just imagine this? Simultaneously, we have several processes going on in Ukraine. It's just at the same time. Full reset of the public service in the country, the reform of the government of the country, large-scale decentralization reform in the country, given the total centralization for the previous decades, history. We started energy sector reform. We started developing new judiciary system in the country. We are restoring and strengthening security and armed forces of Ukraine. We started changes in education, healthcare. We started introducing corporate governance in state public sector. We started on privatization that was supposed to have been worked on 20 years ago. And that's just a short list of the scenes of the tasks that we deal with on an everyday basis. And the range, the scope of this task, and speeding up the success, all that depends on our joint efforts as well. So I believe that at this conference, or as a result of this conference, we'll set up this group that would professionally identify and assess what is it that we have today, what is it that we are going to have in a year, and we'll develop a long-term strategy of success. Let me just note that the most incentivized and encouraged are Ukrainians themselves in that. And naturally, for us, it is very important to remain a reliable, predictable partner for our international partners. And today, I can say that we can provide for this joint, shared, common success. But we do need real, practical efforts, not just the ones that are spoken about, but the ones that are reflected in our actions. Another example, sad, horrible example. Who out of you present in this room have people that are political prisoners and are kept in prisons of the aggressor power. And we do have them. And I believe that today it is crucial for us to, well, being aware of the challenges, to clearly respond to them. And the encouragement to release Sentsov as well as other political prisoners, that's something that should consolidate and unite us, because today we are fighting for democracy. Today, Russia is afraid and fear the success in Ukraine and does everything to hinder that, not to allow for this success. And that's the fight inside Ukraine as well. So I am encouraging all of us, all of you, let's practically every day, if Ukraine is important for you, because you are very important for Ukraine, because the success of Ukraine will stop the aggressor that could be a threat to many countries present here. And eventually, we all have to win this war for democracy and democratic values. And today, Ukraine, as no any other country in the world, shows this solidarity. Let's do this together. I'm deeply convinced that we should work at better understanding of the processes we see happening in our country. I very much hope that we'll work to make the next conference happen, and we'll make sure that the representation of the countries is going to be high at this conference to make important strategic decisions that will make democratic world stronger. I think that deserves our joint efforts and fight. Thank you very much for attention, for the readiness to be with Ukraine, and please remember that Ukraine is always with you. Ukraine is now with you. And let me say, release Oleg Sentsov, freedom to Sentsov. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you. One other sentence until my colleagues are coming in up. You know, I think in the course of the thematic discussions, you will learn a lot of new things that we saw happened in Ukraine within last year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now call on the host of today's conference, Foreign Minister of Denmark, Anders Samuelsen.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Prime Minister. Your final remarks are testimony to your strong commitment to reform and to real change. The reform results, which you have outlined here today, are indeed impressive. Thanks to all ministers, vice ministers, and senior officials who gave statements and confirmed the strong international support to Ukraine. They have shown that despite variations in areas of focus and priorities, we all agree on two things: that a reformed Ukraine are of vital importance both for the Ukrainians and for the international community, and that a stable and prosperous Ukraine is indeed a shared goal for all of us. I'm glad that this conference has proven itself not to be a one-off event. Rather, it has become a building block for dialogue and change. And luckily, today is not the end of this process. Thank you all for coming today, and with these words, I give the floor to Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada, Chrystia Freeland.
Okay, well, you surprised me with that, Anders. I didn't know there was more to say. So let me just say thank you very much, Anders, and to the Danish colleagues for their great work this year. Thank you to our Ukrainian friends for their great work every day. And we look forward to welcoming everyone to Canada a year from now. Bienvenue au Canada. Будемо вас вітати.
That was the end of the plenary session. There will now be a press conference with the Prime Minister of Ukraine, the Foreign Minister of Denmark, EU High Representative, UK Foreign Secretary, as well as the Foreign Ministers of Canada and the Ukraine. Du må være det.
Ja, nu er jeg her. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Kan du høre noget nu? 1, 2, 3. Har noget forbindelse igennem? 1, 2, 3, 4. Ja, ja. Ja, men jeg taler igen. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yksi, kaksi, kolme, neljä. Nå, 1, 2. Jamen, jeg taler ikke fuldt tryk på, vel, men det vil nok være 6 dB højere, når jeg taler herinde, ikke? Okay.
We can hear you.
Thank you.
Everybody set? Yeah. Okay. To this press conference. I will begin with a few opening remarks before I pass the floor to Prime Minister of Ukraine, Groysman, and I will then give the floor to the host of last year's conference, the UK Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. And then we will open the floor for questions to all of us up here. We have just ended the first part of today's conference. Prime Minister Groysman presented an excellent overview of the reform progress achieved since the London conference last year. And we have heard statements by a number of foreign ministers and high-level representatives from the EU, G7 and NATO countries, as well as international organizations. All have underlined the international community's strong support for Ukraine. The backdrop of our efforts in Ukraine is Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and aggression against Ukraine. We must never forget the 10,000 Ukrainians who died because of this conflict. This is why the success of Ukraine's reform process is so important for Denmark and for Europe. A reformed, stable and prosperous Ukraine is the best response to the Russian aggression. And it will demonstrate to the Kremlin that Europe will not accept returning to a Cold War between East and West based on spheres of interests. Ukraine has made impressive reforms. Some has not been easy. The adoption of the law of the High Anti-Corruption Court in the run-up to this conference is a reminder that there is still political will for change and reform. This is indeed a landmark decision that has the potential to end the impunity for high-level corruption and strengthen the Ukrainian population's belief in the reform process. And today, we heard loud and clear from the Prime Minister that more should and will be done. It won't be easy. Western political and economic interests are trying to prevent reform. I'm sure that today's conference will give a friendly push for further reforms and will strengthen the partnership between Ukraine and the international community. I'm glad that Canada has offered to host next year's conference. Denmark stands ready to assist Canada and remain part of the key supporters for change in Ukraine. With these words, I'll pass the floor to Prime Minister of Ukraine, Groysman.
Thank you, Minister Samuelson. Thank you, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank you, thank Denmark for hosting this conference today, a very important second conference on Ukrainian reforms. This is a platform that brings us all together, allowing us to exchange opinions about the status of the things in Ukraine, the reforms, the transformations taking place in Ukraine, evaluate them, plan them for the future. That's the end of the first part, where we have discussed the current situation. Now there's going to be a second part where we're going to hear some very interesting panels, where we will talk more about those tasks and objectives that we have on our agenda that Ukraine has already implemented, which were our tasks, our homework. And I would like to stress that the reforms in Ukraine are something that Ukraine and Ukrainians need. We live through difficult times when a new Ukrainian state is being built and developed, and to be successful, to be faster, we need support of the democratic world. Because today we are fighting for our right to choose, for a right to have our own state, our territorial integrity, vis-à-vis the aggressor country, which Russia unfortunately is. And when we speak about the losses that we're bearing, and they're the highest ones, casualties, people's lives, tragedies. Today there's almost 11,000 people who have been killed by Russia in Ukraine, in my country, sovereign country. More than 27,000 wounded people. Every day we face challenges, the idea of that are related to the need to confront the aggressor. So today this discussion is very important. I have suggested to set up a joint high-level working group to evaluate the progress of reforms and the tasks for long-term prospect as to how we can, while relying on support of the international partners, to build new instruments for sustainable development, for successful growth in Ukraine. This is what the Ukrainians are waiting for. That's what our international partners are waiting for. And I'm deeply convinced that while preparing for the next year's conference that Canada has agreed to host, and we're grateful to Canada for that, we will be able to present to you this joint action plan about sustainability, about long-term prospects. That's why we are moving toward change. We have been able to provide progress in many areas. We have very many tasks. As I have said it today, this effective period of change has only been now 3 years. Well, a little bit more than 3 years. And that means that this progress is related to the new civil service, the new system of self-government in the Ukraine, economic, political reforms, the anti-corruption. All of these are decisions that have been approved. We keep moving ahead. We will be successful. We will be a reliable and predictable partner for our partners, for the democratic world. So thank you once again. And thank you, Boris Johnson, for the first conference. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for the second conference. And I hope that the third conference will also be a success. Thank you.
Very, very quickly, I just want to congratulate you and as Minister Samuelson, I should say, on organising this so well, and to say how uplifting it has been to hear from our Ukrainian friends about the progress that you are making, Prime Minister Groysman and Pavlo. It's great to hear that you're doing this in the teeth of opposition and intimidation from Russia. And we know what's still going on in the Donbass. We know what happened in Crimea. It is vital that we stick up for our friends in Ukraine. And we're going to be carrying that message to the NATO summit and beyond. And believe me, I was also very pleased to hear about some of the things that you're doing with the high-level anti-corruption court. I agree with you about the working group that we should be setting up to try to get a roadmap for economic reform in Ukraine. And clearly, reform has got to prevail. It must prevail. And it will prevail. I think the people of Ukraine will win from this process. And all I want to say is that the UK will be with you every step of the way. We're there supporting you in training your military. We're there in helping you to tackle corruption, helping you with the judiciary, and in many other respects. And we are there for the long term. So I think this process of Ukraine reform conferences is extremely valuable. I'm delighted to say that Christia is taking on the torch is being passed next year in a smooth three-quarter movement down the line. That's a metaphor from rugby, by the way. Down the line to Christia, who will be hosting it next year.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions. Start with that.
This is a question from TV to Denmark to Mr. Prime Minister Groysman. You mentioned in your speech before that the situation in Ukraine is quite difficult, also a difficult situation, I understood, in order to implement the required reforms. Critics, though, argue that this Russian aggression still going on is just a bad excuse to implement and to actually make the necessary reforms. What do you say to that? I mean, some reforms can be made even though Russia is aggressing your country.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. in fact, Russian tanks that attack the sovereign state are hindering a lot of different processes, in particular expanding the reforms over the occupied territories, as well as the Crimea that has been annexed. But in the course of 3 years and a half, we managed to undertake and implement structural changes. I do understand that in democratic world we always have those who support and criticize. The same in Ukraine. We have those who support and who criticize us. We welcome constructive criticism, but Russia will never stop us in our aspiration to become full-fledged partner of large Europe. We are 45 million country, and we are powerful. We'll counter the attack of Russia. These attacks are not a threat to Ukraine only. That's a threat to European partners and a threat to democracy that require consolidated efforts, therefore, and that's what we spoke about today as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Irina Sommer. A question in Ukrainian for Ukrainian Prime Minister, if I may, and in English to all of you. Premier Minister.
Mr. Prime Minister, you spoke about the need to create high-level working group. What is it that you meant? How do you see the work of this group, and why would you need this group if you have advisors, even the advisors from the EU?
Knowing a specific of Ukrainian politics, especially in the period of election, what can be your some kind of recipe for Ukrainian government to continue on the path of real reform despite the elections? Thank you.
The conference today is the platform that allow to assess the progress of changes and set up the priorities for the upcoming period. But we need to expand the planning period, the scope of it. And we are talking about a coordinating center of all support, not within the association agreement only, but the one that includes all our allies and partners. Therefore, I do appreciate Boris, Anders, and Christy for welcoming this initiative, and therefore we'll be able to set up this group that would define the changes that are needed for the period of 5-7 years, as well as the mechanisms to support these changes, to make the changes happening quicker and more effectively. That's the time for employing new tools and mechanisms, and you'll see that this joint work will answer many questions as to the success of Ukraine, and Russia is so afraid of the success.
Say that Ukraine will have an electoral year next year, but there's still almost 1 year to go to the first election. So time is still there to put in place, put in the pipeline and implement the important reforms that have been done already and that are still needed. And I want to say here in front of the media what I had already the opportunity to say in front of the media in Kiev. I really am impressed by the determination and the energy with which the Prime Minister and the government are pushing for reforms, especially on the anti-corruption. I believe this is really key for your country. So the encouragement is to continue and to add good reforms to the good reforms that have been already put in place. Second, elections are not a moment where everything is suspended. Elections are the salt of democracy, are the moment when we celebrate our citizens' right to choose those that are governing the country. It's not a moment of suspension of public life. On the contrary, it's the highest moment of the democratic public life. So this should be also a moment where the government can proudly present to the Ukrainian people that have been asking for reforms, results, and the way ahead. Being able to count on the full support of the international partners. As I said, the European Union has been there from the very beginning with massive political but financial support and will continue to do so.
Another question?
Russian news agency RIA Novosti, based in Sweden. I have two questions. My name is Ludmila Bashko. Are there any negotiations regarding the exchange of Vyshinsky for Sintsov? At which stage? What stage is it? And another question is: the IMF insists on bringing gas prices for the population to market levels. Is your government taking this step? Are you planning to take this step?
Thank you for your questions. As a matter of fact, today we see the need in liberating the political prisoners, unfortunately, who are held in Russia by Moscow today in the prisons all over Russia. This is a challenge to our democracy, and it's hard to speak about any talks. We need to speak about the demands of the democratic world in terms of setting free the citizens of our sovereign country. Now, as regards the market mechanisms, we now continue these discussions with the IMF. But for Ukraine, it is very important to see when the Russian Federation will meet the decision of Stockholm Court of Arbitration, will give us back $2.5 billion based on the decision of the Stockholm Arbitration Court. These are two very important things. One is important for our democracy, the other for our economic stability. Thank you.
Question? Over here.
Yes. Secretary Peter Lovering, Bloomberg. Secretary Johnson, now you're on the verge of Brexit. Do you see any risk that Brexit will hamper your efforts to support Ukraine once it's done? And could you perhaps give a few words on the chance of avoiding a hard Brexit now on the eve of the summit?
Yeah. I thank you. As we've made clear from the very beginning, we think that leaving the EU is an opportunity for the UK to be even more engaged with the rest of the world than ever before. And I want to stress, we may be leaving the EU, we are not leaving Europe. And our friendship and partnership with Ukraine will, if anything, intensify. I've tried to describe some of the things that we're already doing, and that's a relationship that we want to develop for the long term. It's great to see our Ukrainian friends getting on with the reforms that I think are so vital for their future.
And the hard Brexit?
There is going to be a glorious new deal that we'll be able to do in the course of the next year or so, and believe me, it will leave the relationship between the UK and Ukraine intact, and if anything, it will enable us to do even more than we've been doing already.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Okay.